Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 78 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is available in both German and English and has a presence on YouTube, Spotify, Podcast.de, Blue Sky and Instagram. Additionally, there is a music-based companion project on YouTube titled HLIT AI Music. The topic of this episode. In October 2026, the conclusion of the major Nuremberg war crimes trial will mark its 80th anniversary. This serves as an excellent opportunity to look back at the Nuremberg Trials. I will provide an overview of the main war crimes trial and the defendants, as well as touch upon the subsequent trials. I will delve into the defendants themselves gradually in individual episodes, much as I have already done with Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl in episodes 5, 13, 25 and 29. Warning, this is going to be a rather long mammoth episode. Political agenda and background. None. However, I will critically examine the trials. The idea of war crimes trials is a good one. The practice, however, is difficult and differs significantly from the idealistic concepts and portrayals with which we are familiar. The sources that were used. Richard Overy, Interrogations, Propyläen Ullstein Heine List, Munich 2002. Gustav M. Gilbert, Nuremberg Diary, Fischer Verlag, Frankfurt 1962. The idea of putting the German leadership on trial following the end of the Second World War evolved among the Allies during the conflict, albeit in very different forms, depending on the country. War crimes trials had taken place previously. For instance, after the First World War, demands were made of Germany to extradite war criminals. However, since the Allied victory at that time was not complete, they were unable to enforce this demand. At the end of the Second World War, however, the situation was different. Unlike many wars before and since, the losing side had suffered a total defeat and had been completely occupied. It was therefore possible for the victors to put anyone they could arrest on trial as a war criminal. The Soviet Union was absolutely determined to conduct a war crimes trial, specifically one modeled after the show trials held within its own borders during the 1930s. The guilt of the accused would have been a foregone conclusion from the very outset. The purpose of the trial would have been to determine the sentences and to demonstrate the guilt of the accused before the entire world, and in particular before their own people. At the same time, the Soviets sought to demonstrate that they harbored no fear whatsoever of facing a tribunal. In Great Britain, however, a trial was seen as serving no useful purpose. Prime Minister Churchill simply wanted to have the principal defendants executed by firing squad. Regarding this matter, Overy's book states on page 17, "A judicial tribunal was viewed as a legal quagmire in which Hitler and his accomplices could wreak havoc, owing to the absence of a clear-cut international legal code." The US stance was divided. Treasury Secretary Morgenthau led those who shared the British position and pressed for immediate execution by firing squad. Secretary of War Stimson, conversely, viewed this as lynch justice and advocated for a tribunal. Since war crimes fell under the purview of the Department of War, Stimson held the advantage in this matter. The new US President Truman also supported a trial, a stance that tipped the US position closer to that of the Soviets. However, by the end of the war in May 1945, no unified consensus had yet been reached. Nevertheless, the British did not wish to be the sole party to reject a trial. Consequently, defendants detained by the British were kept in custody rather than being executed immediately. In August 1945, the Allies finally agreed to conduct a joint war crimes trial, which commenced in November of that year. It was at this juncture, however, that problems began to emerge. Issues that, while initially appearing to be merely hair-splitting and formalistic, were in fact of profound significance. For the simple fact is, that jurisdiction is a fundamentally national matter. It presupposes the existence of a state, a sovereign entity possessing a unified legal framework, a police force, and a judicial system. As a national of that state, or as an individual committing a legal transgression upon its territory, one may be brought to trial in accordance with that state's laws. However, at the Nuremberg Trials, the proceedings took place on international legal terrain. Consequently, which laws should apply? What penalties should be imposed? Which court held jurisdiction? Nowadays, while the International Criminal Court exists in The Hague, it is extremely weak and dependent on defendants surrendering voluntarily or being voluntarily extradited. Moreover, these states involved in the very conflicts where the greatest number of war crimes are potentially committed are not parties to the court's charter. And stateless entities, such as unrecognized states or terrorist organizations, pose an even greater challenge. Back in 1945, however, not even that existed. The procedural foundations therefore had to be cobbled together from scratch. A common legal framework and a set of shared tribunal rules had to be constructed from a blend of American, British, French, and Soviet law. This undertaking presented significant difficulties. In the USA and Great Britain, the common law system prevails, characterized by few, if any, codified statutes and a heavy reliance on past precedents. In contrast, the French and Soviet systems adhered to Roman law, featuring detailed statutes in which precedents carry very little weight. Furthermore, while the Soviet Union envisioned a show trial, the USA sought to conduct a classic judicial proceeding involving the collection and presentation of evidence, culminating in a verdict based strictly on the facts presented. Moreover, whereas participants from the Western nations were free to operate autonomously, the Soviets were required to have every decision ratified by the state leadership in Moscow, a requirement that significantly prolonged the duration of the proceedings. Ultimately, a mutually acceptable framework was established and the US concept of a classic judicial trial prevailed. A pivotal role in this process was played by US Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, who sought to use the trial to forever outlaw wars of aggression and who delivered a powerful opening statement. The fact that the majority of the high-ranking defendants were in Western custody played a significant role in enabling the USA to implement its vision for the trial. While the Soviets could, of course, have tried their own prisoners according to their own standards, most of the high-value prisoners were in fact in Western custody. The resulting compromise made it possible for the Soviets to exert at least some influence over the fate of those prisoners. Nuremberg was selected as the venue for the proceedings, yet another compromise. The Soviets had originally insisted on Berlin, located within their occupation zone, while the Western Allies would have preferred Munich or Luxembourg. Next, the question had to be answered: who exactly should be indicted? Adolf Hitler was, of course, a certainty, but he evaded a potential trial by committing suicide in late April 1945. Propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels had likewise taken his own life. SS chief Heinrich Himmler had been captured in May 1945 and had poisoned himself. Thus, three of the very big names were no longer available. Churchill had originally intended to have 50 to 100 German leaders arrested and executed. This figure had been chosen arbitrarily. Initially, Italians were also to be indicted, however this plan was abandoned in 1945, partly because Mussolini was already dead, and partly because Italy had been on the Allied side since 1943. The few remaining Italian war criminals were tried before Italian courts, leaving only Germans to face the main trial. There was considerable haggling and bargaining over the individuals who were to be indicted as major war criminals. Figures who are scarcely known today, including leaders of various Nazi party formations, were considered, rejected, and then reconsidered. The American position was that the entire structure of the Nazi state should be put on trial, and that consequently the top representatives of every sector, for example the state leadership, party leadership, economy, military and so forth, should be indicted. However, the principal criminals at the very center, Hitler, Goebbels and Himmler, were missing, which left a distinct void. Even once it became clear who was to be indicted, it was at times difficult to apprehend these individuals. Some were with Admiral Dönitz in the Rump government in the north, including Dönitz himself, as well as Minister of Armaments Speer and Generals Keitel and Jodl. Others had gone into hiding and had to be painstakingly sifted out from among the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. By May, the Americans held in their custody DAF Chief Lai, the head of the Reich Security Main Office Kaltenbrunner, Luftwaffe Chief Göring, former Interior Minister Frick, the head of the General Government Frank, and former Reichsbank President Schacht. The French held former Foreign Minister von Neurath, while the British had arrested the Dönitz government. The publisher of the Nazi magazine Der Stürmer, Julius Streicher, was captured by chance in late May. He had gone into hiding but gave himself away when an American remarked on his resemblance to Streicher. Foreign Minister Ribbentrop was arrested in Hamburg 1 month after the end of the war. Kaltenbrunner had attempted to go into hiding in Austria but was betrayed. Hans Frank had tried to pass himself off as an ordinary prisoner of war and to take his own life. Former Minister of Economics Funk, the chief Nazi ideologue Rosenberg, former Vice-Chancellor von Papen, and Field Marshal Keitel were also American prisoners. The Soviets held only the Nazi radio propagandist Fritzsche and Admiral Räder in their custody. To make the process manageable, the list of major war criminals had to be kept short. While the Soviets and Americans initially favored a figure closer to 100 defendants, the final number stood at 24. As previously noted, the Soviets sought merely to determine the sentences, whereas the Americans insisted on conducting a full evidentiary trial. The inclusion of military figures and business leaders proved particularly controversial. The case of Dönitz in particular sparked debate, as the Allies harbored serious concerns that he might be acquitted due to the weakness of the prosecution's case. Regarding the business leaders, the Soviets, primarily for Marxist reasons, and the Americans were adamant that they be indicted. The British, conversely, viewed this with apprehension, fearing that establishing individual culpability for war crimes and political decisions would be extremely difficult. Another aspect involved the indictment of entire organizations. The Nazi Party in all its affiliated bodies, the Reich Government, the Reich Security Main Office RSHA, the SR, the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, the High Command of the Wehrmacht, the General Staff, and the leaderships of the Luftwaffe, the Navy, and the Army, as well as the Four-Year Plan Office. This too was ultimately reduced to the Reich Government, the party leadership, the SS, the SR, the Gestapo, the SD, the General Staff, and the High Command of the Wehrmacht. In the end, as is so often the case in life, everything was a compromise. Regarding this, Overy's book notes on page 43, in accordance with the principle that specific individuals could be held accountable on behalf of entire organizations, the task at hand was simply to select the most suitable candidate to represent the Wehrmacht, the Gestapo, or the forces of Popular Party anti-Semitism. When Julius Streicher was chosen to answer for the racists within the party, this overlooked the fact that he had little to do with the official execution of the genocide and had in fact been removed from public life long before the systematic extermination of the Jews began. For similar reasons, Kaltenbrunner was made to answer for the Gestapo, even though the actual head of the Gestapo, the brutal career policeman Heinrich Müller, appeared on none of the lists of potential war criminals, nor, for that matter, did Adolf Eichmann. Ultimately, there were 4 counts of the indictment, though not every defendant was charged under every count. Count 1 was conspiracy against peace. This was the most nebulous of the charges, as the concept of conspiracy did not exist in many legal systems, for instance in the German, Soviet, and French systems. The idea underpinning this count was the concept of the subjugation of Europe by the Nazi movement. It focused more on the political concept of German dominance in Europe than on specific concrete actions. On page 53 it states, "Here the excuse 'I was only following orders' was not admissible. A conspiracy implied a certain degree of voluntary participation or complicity, even on the part of those defendants who did not sit directly at the controls of the machinery of war or genocide." Point 2 was planning and waging wars of aggression and crimes against peace. This concerned concrete steps taken to plan and execute wars of aggression. However, this presented a problem for the Soviets, given that they themselves had waged such wars against Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland in 1939 and 40. Soviet interventions ensured that these aspects were, as far as possible, excluded from the proceedings, and consequently the attack on Poland was addressed only partially. A key role was played by the Hossbach Memorandum of 1937, in which Colonel Hossbach summarized a conference held by Hitler, a meeting in which Hitler had openly discussed his warlike objectives in Europe with his military and foreign policy paladins. Point 3. War crimes. Lists already existed enumerating various offenses such as murder and mass murder, acts of terror, deportation, forced labor, and so forth. Consequently, based on international treaties, it was indeed possible to substantiate violations of the law in this area, or alternatively, to draw upon existing legal precedents. Point 4. Crimes against humanity. This charge was also considered relatively straightforward, largely due to the aforementioned lists of war crimes. This specific count was included primarily to encompass the Nazi extermination camps, which were not necessarily integral to the conduct of warfare, and therefore could not be classified strictly as war crimes. Although the term genocide of the Jews is frequently used today, strictly speaking, from a formal legal perspective, Jews did not constitute a people, as there was no corresponding Jewish nation-state in Europe at the time. It was the Nazis themselves who had defined the Jews as a people, not the Jewish people themselves, nor any other nations. To circumvent this legal issue, crimes against humanity was therefore included as an additional count in the indictment. It was not until the course of the trial itself that the term genocide came to be defined as the destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. However, the following additional problem arose here. How could the court find a way to define crimes without the actions of the Soviet government against its own citizens, specifically the Gulag system, or the Jim Crow segregation laws in the USA also being defined as crimes against humanity? The deeper one delved into the individual counts of the indictment, the more complex and difficult the situation became. This drew criticism even from within the ranks of the Allies. As stated on page 56, statement by the Dean of Harvard Law School, Edmund E. Morgan, January 1945, it violated the spirit of Anglo-American legal thought to create a criminal offense only after the act in question had already been committed. While there were indeed certain international treaties dating back to the 1920s, which for instance outlawed war, ultimately no proper legal framework existed. Furthermore, these treaties failed to specify the basis upon which an individual who violated them could be indicted and/or convicted. Evidence in the form of documents, witness testimonies, photographs, videos, audio recordings, and the like was reviewed and evaluated in court. The sheer volume of sworn affidavits and documents in particular led to tedious delays and moments of boredom during the trial. Dramatic cross-examinations, such as those of Otto Ohlendorf of the SS Einsatzkommando or the major war criminals themselves, were the exception rather than the rule. Incidentally, Hitler's book Mein Kampf proved to be of little utility to the proceedings. On page 57 it states, a detailed analysis of Mein Kampf by the Foreign Office, a work described as a key document, inevitably led to the conclusion that the book did not fully or explicitly reveal the National Socialist objectives of conquest and domination. As someone who has read the book personally, I must concur with the US Foreign Office on this point. While it is commonly asserted today that Hitler openly announced all his future measures in advance, this is not entirely accurate. Of course, one could infer a great deal from his book and his speeches. However, anyone expecting to find within Mein Kampf a detailed blueprint for the conquest of Europe or a specific plan of action against the Jews, complete with references to concentration camps, will search in vain. I will now briefly review the defendants individually. 1. Martin Bormann, representing the Nazi Party. His position, chief of the party chancellery. At the time of the trial, he was already dead. However, this was unclear at the time. 2. Karl Dönitz, representing the state and the military. His position, chief of the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, from 1943, and chief of the U-boat arm since the beginning of the war. 3. Hans Frank, representing the party and the state. His position, chief of the general government in Poland from 1939 to 45. 4. Wilhelm Frick, representing the party and the state. His position, Minister of the Interior from 1933 to 43 and Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia from 1943 to 45. 5. Hans Fritzsche, serving as a substitute for Joseph Goebbels and representing the field of propaganda. His position, radio propagandist from 1933 to 45. 6. Walter Funk, representing the state and the economy. His position, State Secretary in the Ministry of Propaganda from 1933 to 37 and Minister of Economics from 38 to 45. 7. Hermann Göring, representing the state, the party, the economy and the military. As the de facto highest-ranking Nazi politician, he served as the stand-in for Hitler during the trial. His primary positions, of which he held a great many, Chief of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, Chief of the Four-Year Plan and founder of the Gestapo. 8. Rudolf Hess, serving as the so-called Deputy Führer from 33 to 41 and representing the party. 9. Alfred Jodl, representing the military within the High Command of the Armed Forces. 10. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, representing the police services, essentially serving as the stand-in for Himmler. His position, police and SS leader in Austria from 38 to 43 and chief of the Reich Security Main Office from 43 to 45. 11. Wilhelm Keitel as the military representative within the Wehrmacht High Command. 12. Gustav Bohlen von Krupp and Halbach as the representative of the business sector. He served as chairman and president of the Krupp Company. However, since 1941, his health had been severely compromised following a stroke. Ultimately, he was deemed unfit to stand trial and was therefore scheduled to be replaced on short notice by his son, a request, however, that the court rejected. 13. Robert Ley. His position, head of the German Labor Front and thus a representative of both the party and the state. 14. Konstantin von Neurath as the representative of the state. His positions, Foreign Minister from 1932 to 38 and Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia from 1938 to 43. 15. Franz von Papen, who served as Reich Chancellor in 1932. His positions, Vice Chancellor under Hitler in 33-34, Ambassador to Austria from 34 to 38 and Ambassador to Turkey from 38 to 44. 16. Erich Raeder, Chief of the Navy from 1928 to 43. 17. Joachim von Ribbentrop, NS Party Foreign Policy Official, Ambassador to Great Britain 36 to 38, Foreign Minister 38 to 45. 18. Alfred Rosenberg, Chief Ideology Officer of the Nazi Party and Minister for the Occupied Eastern Territories, 41 to 45. 19. Fritz Sauckel, Gauleiter of Thuringia, from 27 to 45, additionally Plenipotentiary General for Labor Deployment, 42 to 45. 20. Hjalmar Schacht, President of the Reichsbank from 23 to 30, again in 33 and in 37 and 38. Minister of Economics, 34 to 37. Plenipotentiary General for the War Economy, 35 to 37. And Minister without Portfolio, 37 to 43. However, due to disputes with the Nazi leadership, he had held no actual duties since 1939. 21. Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, 33 to 40, and Gauleiter of Vienna, 40 to 45. 22. Arthur Seyß-Inquart, Austrian Chancellor, 1938, Deputy to Frank in Poland in 39 and 40, and Reich Commissioner for the Occupied Netherlands from 40 to 45. 23. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, 42 to 45, previously an architect. 24. Julius Streicher, publisher of Der Stürmer and Gauleiter of Franconia from 29 to 40. The defendants were caught psychologically off guard by the fact that they were put on trial. Despite the drastic differences between the military defeats of 1918 and 45, many had likely expected a kind of repeat performance of the Treaty of Versailles and the events of 1918 and 19. Although the Dönitz government controlled little more than a handful of towns and possessed neither resources nor means of communication in most parts of Germany, it proceeded on the assumption that it would be able to conduct the affairs of government in Germany. In reality, however, it was incapable of doing so. Even the mere issuance of surrender orders had strained the capabilities of the Dönitz government to the absolute limit. Following the collapse of the Wehrmacht's organizational structures in the wake of the capitulation on May 8th and 9th, 45, the Dönitz government no longer possessed any function in infrastructure or administration whatsoever. On this subject, page 10 states, the realization that the Allies would simply imprison the entire government, the military leadership, and the diplomatic corps triggered a range of traumatic reactions among the prisoners: shock, a deep-seated and disorienting sense of shame, hysterical behavior, and even memory loss. The few who were tormented by genuine feelings of guilt sank into deep depression. "Why don't you just shoot us?" asked one of the prisoners. During their imprisonment, the prisoners were interrogated. These interrogations were subsequently analyzed and utilized in court proceedings. The Soviets encountered the greatest difficulties in this regard, as their interrogation methods, typical of show trials, proved ineffective. In Soviet prisons, an entire machinery of procedures existed to coerce confessions, thereby reducing interrogations to a mere formality. Such methods were not possible in Nuremberg. On pages 11 and 12 it states, the interrogations bore little resemblance to modern criminal interrogation methods, in which the rights of the arrested are upheld, including the right to remain silent. The defeated enemy appeared neither defiant, nor did he openly obstruct the course of justice. Defeat engendered a dull sense of resignation, even among the most die-hard National Socialists. The detention of the prisoners in U.S. custody prior to the trial was harsh and certainly not luxurious, but it was adequate. There was virtually no mistreatment. The food met the standards prevailing in Germany at the time and was correspondingly meager, though it was no worse than that of the average German citizen. The guards treated the prisoners with contempt and subjected them to intense psychological pressure. On more than one occasion, they were threatened that if they resisted during interrogation, they would be handed over to the Soviets. The prisoners were permitted to converse with one another and were wiretapped. Indeed, placing them in contact with one another was a deliberate strategy, undertaken in the hope that they would let something slip. Between August and November 45, the prisoners were transferred to Nuremberg. Those who had not been held in the main U.S. military detention facility had experienced varying conditions. Speer and Räder, for instance, had fared relatively well, while Fritzsche and Schacht had fared rather poorly. Once in Nuremberg, however, conditions became uniform. The prisoners were held in solitary cells, and daily routines were rigidly structured. From the time of their arrival in Nuremberg, an official ban on speaking was in effect, though writing was permitted, as was access to the prison library. The standard defense of most defendants involved shifting all responsibility onto the absentees, namely Hitler, Himmler, Bormann, and Goebbels. As far as possible, they denied having known anything, claiming instead to have focused solely on their own specific areas of responsibility. In cases where denial was not possible, they asserted that they had merely been recipients of orders and had attempted to mitigate those orders. Quote pages 150-151. Yet the refusal to accept responsibility did not manifest itself in the same way in everyone. Hess repressed reality almost completely. Ribbentrop and Funk, for their part, in an effort to evade uncomfortable truths, displayed glaring gaps in their memory. The military defendants refused to acknowledge that the Wehrmacht had systematically committed war crimes, insisting that they had done nothing other than wage war, just as their enemies had. Saukel, Ley, Frick, and Kaltenbrunner steadfastly maintained that they had merely carried out administrative duties and were not responsible for any crimes that might have been hatched in the shadows of their official duties, whether by the thousands of their subordinates or by other organs of the Nazi apparatus. The conservatives who had accepted Hitler in 1933 and subsequently collaborated with him, namely Schacht, von Papen, and von Neurath, put forward the dubious argument, typical of fellow travelers, that their participation in the government had enabled them to exert a moderating influence on a regime that, left unchecked, might otherwise have given free rein to its radical impulses. Only Hans Frank was willing to confess that he had knowingly served an unjust cause, something he now regretted infinitely, yet even he refused to accept that he personally had committed any crime. On pages 161-162 it further states, "Forgetfulness, denial, suicide. These were the primary weapons in the arsenal of psychological defense against accusations of monstrous crimes. They were employed chiefly by the men of the party whose culpability was scarcely open to doubt. For those defendants whom the party had favored, yet who were not National Socialists themselves, Schacht, von Papen, von Neurath, and the Wehrmacht defendants Keitel, Jodl, Räder, and Dönitz, the question of responsibility was less clear-cut. They represented a conservative Germany that had little use for the Weimar Republic or for mass democracy in general, a Germany that deeply loathed communism and harbored a deep-seated resentment toward other major powers for the manner in which they had treated Germany after 1919. In the military sphere, the defense attempted to argue that the Allies had engaged in similar conduct, for instance with regard to unrestricted submarine warfare or the bombing of cities. The court officially declined to admit this as exculpatory evidence. However, it did take into account indirectly when determining the sentences, as was the case, for example, with Admiral Dönitz. Many of the witnesses were surprisingly candid, shattering the defense strategies and illusions of the accused. Particularly when it came to the extermination of the Jews, the emotionless and mechanical manner in which individual witnesses enumerated deeds and figures was almost unbearable, both for the accused and for the court itself. On page 168, the book describes how Adolf Eichmann's deputy, Dieter Wisliceni, listed in meticulous detail exactly how many people he had ordered transported from which countries to the extermination camps, while clearly highlighting any uncertainties. Quote, Poland 3.5 million, Germany 180,000, Hungary 500,000 plus, Slovakia 52,000. Bohemia and Moravia combined 200,000, Greece 60,000 plus sign, Bulgaria 6,000 plus sign, Croatia 3,000 plus sign, Italy 14,000. Denmark and Norway combined 6,000 ? France 220,000 ? Holland 40,000, Belgium 20,000, total 4,817,000. Other witnesses, such as Ohlendorf and Auschwitz Commandant Höss, were similarly candid in their testimony, paying meticulous attention to detail. It is reasonable to assume that the defendants in reality did not know, or did not wish to know, much about these specifics. However, they were fully aware of the ultimate results, a fact they nonetheless denied. SS-Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who had suppressed the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, spoke with surprising frankness during an interrogation, excerpts of which are reproduced on page 168. The entire German government apparatus, a portion of which now stands accused, knew from the very beginning exactly how things stood. Of course, Himmler is dead. They knew that, and they also knew that he would be unable to defend himself. Consequently, their tactic is to pin everything on Himmler and thereby exonerate themselves. The testimony of former camp prisoners transformed abstract statistics into tangible human fates, accounts that left even the defendants themselves visibly moved. The charge of genocide, which incidentally did not yet exist as a distinct legal offense at the time, proved surprisingly difficult to prosecute during the trial. The Soviet Union refused to draw any distinction between the extermination camps, the murder of the Jews, and the crimes committed within its own territory. The sites of the extermination of the Jews were all located within the Soviet sphere of influence, which complicated the analysis. On this point, page 169 states, all the major war criminals denied having had any direct involvement in the persecution of the Jews. Many of them openly admitted to having been anti-Semites, yet few continued to profess their anti-Semitic convictions once the evidence of unimaginable atrocities began to mount. However, they found it difficult to conceal their lingering prejudices. The defendants admitted to knowing only as much as could be proven against them beyond a reasonable doubt, for instance through their own statements or documents they themselves had authored. Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, for example, denied having had any knowledge of the extermination of the Jews. However, letters were subsequently discovered, addressed to the heads of state of Hungary and Bulgaria, in which Ribbentrop wrote of the radical German solution to the Jewish question and furthermore proposed the extermination of the Hungarian Jews. At the time, the number of Jews killed could only be roughly estimated, with figures ranging somewhere between 4.5 million and 9 million. The trial ultimately lasted over 200 days and was conducted simultaneously in 4 languages: English, French, Russian, and German. This was a logistical and administrative feat that first had to be successfully managed. So what were the verdicts? The following defendants received the death penalty by hanging. 1. Bormann in absentia. 2. Frank. He accepted the verdict with a smile, stating that he deserved it. 3. Frick. He remained composed during the pronouncement of the verdict, remarking that he had expected nothing else. 4. Göring. The former Luftwaffe chief was shattered by the verdict and wished to be left alone initially. On the evening before his scheduled execution, he took his own life by poison. 5. Jodl. He conceded that someone had to answer for all that had happened, but he protested against being hanged as, in his view, this method was reserved for criminals and not for a soldier like himself. 6. Kaltenbrunner. He reacted with tension and anxiety. 7. Keitel. Much like Jodl, he was primarily appalled that he would be hanged like a criminal rather than executed by firing squad like a soldier. 8. Ribbentrop. He was horrified and saddened by the realization that he would no longer be able to write his memoirs. From this point onward, if not sooner, he was a broken man. 9. Rosenberg. He reacted with fury and rage. 10. Saukel. He trembled, wept, and considered the verdict unjust. 11. Seyss-Inquart. He remained calm, claiming that he had expected nothing else. 12 Streicher. He too had expected nothing else. Sentenced to prison terms were 13 Dönitz, 10 years. He did not understand the verdict and saw no responsibility on his part whatsoever. 14 Funk, life imprisonment. He was completely broken down nervously. 15 Hess, life imprisonment. He claimed that he had not been listening during the pronouncement of the verdict. 16 von Neurath, 15 years. He was speechless. 17 Räder, life imprisonment. The admiral refused to speak to anyone and was a nervous wreck. 18 von Schirach, 20 years. He reacted with gravity and tension. Later he remarked that he would have preferred a quick death to a slow one. 19 Speer, 20 years. He was nervous and claimed to have expected nothing less, given his own role. However, he was pleased that Fritzsche had been acquitted. For there were also 3 acquittals. 20 Fritzsche. The radio propagandist was completely shattered nervously and overjoyed that he was not sent back to the Soviet Union. 21 von Papen. He was pleased and surprised, for he had hoped for it, but had not counted on it. 22 Schacht. He felt himself and his stance vindicated. The trials of the final 2 defendants could not be brought to completion. 23 Krupp. His unfitness to stand trial was of a permanent nature. 24 Lai. He had taken his own life while in custody in October 45. The death sentences were carried out approximately 2 weeks after the verdicts were pronounced. There was no right of appeal. What became of the other defendants? Dönitz was released upon completion of a sentence in 1956 and died in 1980. In 1947, Fritzsche was sentenced by a denazification court to 9 years of hard labor. He was released in 1950 and died in 1953. Funk was released in 1957 due to poor health and died in 1960. Hess remained in custody until 1987, when he hanged himself. His fate after 1966, as the last and sole prisoner in Spandau, was unique. The Soviets in particular repeatedly refused to grant him a pardon, presumably in part because doing so allowed them to maintain a regular guard presence in Spandau, which was located in West Berlin. To this day his suicide is questioned in neo-Nazi circles. He was after all 94 years old and is portrayed as murder. However, there is no evidence to support this claim. Krupp never recovered from his stroke and remained in need of constant care until his death in 1950. Von Neurath was released in 1954 following a heart attack and died in 1956. In 1947, von Papen was sentenced by a denazification court to 8 years of hard labor, but was released in 1949. He died in 1969. Räder was released in 1955 due to poor health and died in 1960. In 1947, Schacht was sentenced by a denazification court to 8 years of hard labor, but was released in 1948. He died in 1970. Von Schirach was released upon completion of his sentence in 1966 and died in 1974. Speer was released upon completion of his sentence in 1966 and died in 1981. Incidentally, the Nuremberg Trials do not include the numerous denazification proceedings that were also conducted. That was the reason why those who had been acquitted were put on trial again and convicted. The trial of the major war criminals was followed by 12 additional war crimes trials, each targeting specific groups of defendants. These were specifically: 1. The doctor's trial, primarily directed against physicians in connection with euthanasia and concentration camps. 2. The Milch trial against Field Marshal Milch of the Luftwaffe. 3. The judge's trial against the Nazi judiciary. 4. The Pole trial against the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, and by extension against the use of forced labor, among other crimes. 5. The Flick trial against German industry. 6. The IG Farben trial, also directed against German industry. 7. The hostages trial, directed against generals serving in the Balkans and their methods of occupation. 8. The RUSHA trial, directed against the SS Race and Settlement Main Office and its activities in occupied territories. including expulsion, expropriation, forced sterilization and abortion, deportation and mass murder. 9. The Einsatzgruppen trial, focused on mass murder activities carried out behind the front lines. 10. The Krupp trial, another trial against German industry. In this case, the son of Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was ultimately indicted. 11. The Ministries trial, Wilhelmstraßen trial, focused on individual high-ranking officials within the German ministries. And 12. The High Command trial, focused on individual military officers associated with the High Command of the Wehrmacht. In these subsequent trials, another 25 death sentences were handed down, of which, however, only 12 were carried out, along with 117 prison sentences, including 20 life terms, 35 acquittals, 4 discontinued proceedings, and 4 proceedings terminated due to suicide. The 12 executed death sentences comprised 7 physicians from the doctor's trial, Oswald Pohl from the Pohl trial, and 4 high-ranking SS officers from the Einsatzgruppen trial. A few finishing words. My personal opinion is this: the concept of a war crimes trial is a sound one. However, the reality is complex, nebulous, and often highly problematic. Even though I oppose specialized detention facilities such as the US facility at Guantanamo Bay, I nonetheless understand why they exist. Figures like Osama bin Laden or Adolf Hitler do not issue signed orders for acts of terror or war crimes in triplicate, ready to be used as evidence against them in court. Instead, they might rant about some grievance in front of a gathered assembly, then turn to someone and say, "Handle this," leaving the details entirely to that individual. It is that individual who then formulates the actual orders and issues them, whether in writing or verbally. Clearly establishing this chain of command in court and thereby assigning responsibility is an extremely difficult task. And while the principle of command responsibility exists today, in 1945 it represented uncharted territory in international law to legally and irrefutably trace the chain of events from political intent to the concrete criminal act. If it can be so difficult to bring demonstrably guilty individuals such as Himmler or Hitler to trial and secure a conviction, then how ought we to deal with war criminals in general? I leave this question deliberately open, for I do not hold a definitive opinion on the matter. In saying this, I do not intend to pass judgment on the specific defendants who stood trial at Nuremberg. I will present my opinion regarding each individual in the dedicated episodes covering them. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.